joined us today for our webinar on moving to a more proactive recruiting strategy. My name is Stephen Schwander, and I work with Talemetry. Briefly, I'll say my role here is as the Director of Client Solutions, and I bring to the table a better part of 20 years of recruiting strategy and operations background. And I'm joined by our head of marketing, Ian Alexander. Ian, how are you today?
I'm great, Stephen. Thank you, and hello, everybody, and really excited to be here today.
Excellent. So Ian and I are going to share some things that we've learned over the last couple of years working with our telemetry clients, but really over a lifetime of working in the recruitment marketing space. So we're really happy to have you all join us today. And before we get going, we just want to remind you that we've got a capability to take questions in the chat or in the questions section. So as questions come up, feel free to write them in there, and we will certainly answer them as best we can throughout the course of the webinar today. First of all, we should probably introduce you to Talemetry if you haven't heard of Talemetry in the past. Talemetry has been in the space for well over a decade, 12, 13 years now. Some of you have been around as long as Ian and I have, may remember us from Resume Mirror and Resume Parsing. We've obviously grown as the needs and the market has grown, and we are now a full platform suite offering recruitment marketing, recruitment advertising, job distribution, mobile candidate experience, and most importantly, what we'll talk about today, source and CRM capability. Now, we provide all of this with a really deep ATS integration with several of the largest ATSs and lighter with the rest. And the really cool thing about the deep ATS integration is that the analytics that come when we can look at not only who's viewing job postings and who's responding, but we can actually look at the higher data as well. So that's a little bit about Talemetry. Let's talk about our agenda for this next 55 minutes together. We're going to talk about kind of the definition, what really is proactive recruiting or direct sourcing or whatever you might call it in your environment. Why is it important? Let's talk about some of the impediments to change, as if you know, we don't all hit our heads against the brick wall anyway and kind of understand what they are, but let's wrestle with them a little bit. And then we're going to jump into some key practices to help kind of drive a more proactive recruiting success. Now, we may not get as deep as we'd like to get in such a short period of time, but our team has developed a predictable hiring a web book that we're going to make available to you, and this will go into a lot more in-depth and also be a really good takeaway as you try to put these strategies into place. So you all get a link to this at the end of the webinar, and we hope you'll enjoy that. So what is proactive recruiting? Well, you know, I don't know if you're all familiar with the Aesop fable of the grasshopper and the ant. If you remember, all of the ants kind of gathering food all during the hot summer months and the fall months, and you know, they get to winter, and the grasshopper's been doing nothing all summer but kind of fiddling on his fiddle, and all of a sudden he's hungry and he's got to go off and beg for food, which unfortunately the ants say no to him, which admittedly wasn't very nice, but it's a tough lesson to learn, right? So recruiting is very much the same way. You know, our managers want to fill open jobs as quickly as possible with you know, top qualified candidates, and that just simply can't be delivered on any sort of consistent basis unless we have you know, started to push a more proactive recruiting. So it's really a strategy that emphasizes you know, proactivity, right? Getting out there, identifying what our need is, and then actively searching and engaging talent that meets that need, or at least closely meets that need at the beginning of the pipeline, so that we're going to have people when we need them at the point of need. So that's just a little bit about you know, what we're talking about today when we talk about predictive hiring. So what all is involved when we talk about proactive recruiting in terms of a definition and in terms of an activity? Now, a lot of this is pretty natural. So as recruiters, in fact, you know, if this were a webinar with a camera, you'd see that my hair is gray enough to realize that I started recruiting back before the internet. And so this whole concept of sourcing was really key back then. As a matter of fact, I remember buying printed directories off the street, employee directories in New York, because we were doing hiring into the Wall Street firms. And so sourcing for us back then was literally smiling and dialing off of just a name and a phone number. And that's all the data that we had to start with back then, and we had to literally build our databases from scratch. Well, that's not totally the case anymore. Now, notice I say totally the case, right? We've got a lot of data to source from. Most recruiters that we talk to in the course of every day will say their number one source is LinkedIn. Makes sense, because they have the most data on the people who are in the system are actually in LinkedIn. So it makes sense, the data is there. Other recruiters are using open web. They're running Boolean searches. They're using tools to pull that data down into CSV files and working with them in large data systems. Some are using other social networks other than LinkedIn, Facebook, for instance. Others are using resume databases. Some of our more advanced clients now are walking away from some of the paid third-party databases, but I would argue that we may not want to walk away from them just yet. There's a lot of really good data in them, even though some of the data is aged. I can tell you that because I just got 2 phone calls this morning on a very old resume asking if I wanted to be a contract recruiter. But that said, even that old data tells those recruiters that I am somehow in the HR recruiting and HRIS space, right? So it's still a starting point. There's some very valid and good data there. ATS data, applicant tracking system data. You've got tons of past data from people who have applied for jobs in the past, whether they were successful or not. It's really good data, and it's a great starting point. Referrals, events, all sorts of places to source data in. So one key aspect of proactive recruiting is to open up as many funnels of data as possible. Pipelining, right? So proactive recruiting includes sourcing, where does the data come from, and then pipelining, basically centralizing all of that data, building segments, and then managing very specific talent pools, and then finally engaging. Right, so the data is no good in there unless you're going to actually reach out and touch someone, shall we say, right? So sourcing email campaigns, nurture campaigns, brand reinforcement. One of the things we haven't put on here that I would add would be even telephone calls, right? Ooh, yes, how old school, but engaging the candidates that are in the database.
Your hair is gray, Stephen.
You remember the phone?
So, must be white.
Thanks, Ian. Yes.
All right, so telephone calls, and then that kind of leads into sort of sorry to step on you there, Stephen, but
right.
It kind of leads into why proactive recruiting, right? So we've kind of defined, for the purposes of discussion here, what we're talking about, but the why. All right, so one of the big factors is job boards, the sort of attraction model alone by itself doesn't work anymore, and some of the reasons for that is Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that there's about 1.5 active candidate today for every open job. And that is projected to get even worse over the next 3-4 years, lower and lower. And that's not even 1.5 qualified applicant, that's 1.5 applicant per job, right? So increasingly, your best candidates are already employed and they're not looking at job boards. As we all know, job boards can be effective in hiring employees, but with the good comes a lot of unqualified candidates that you have to wade through and can clog up the works. And traditionally, we've kind of approached job boards as kind of a now or never proposition, right? So you either you get a requisition that you need to advertise on, and you distribute to the boards, and if you get a hire, you get a hire. If you don't, well, then the next time, a couple months later, you got another job you have to advertise for that's very similar. Go out and you advertise and you pay to get some of the same candidates coming back again. In other words, you're not leveraging the candidates, or most organizations are not leveraging those candidates over time. So it turns into kind of a now or never proposition. Channels to candidates are just continually getting more and more fragmented, and that comes in the form of, there's a proliferation of specialized job boards out there. In addition, competition for attention is just getting greater and greater every year. And we're all kind of connected to our mobile devices. There's a ton of social content that we consume every day. Internet is giving us information all the time. We're connected to our email. We're working. This all makes it much more difficult to get someone's attention with sort of an attraction model. And so consequently, passive candidates play a bigger role as well as referrals. For proactive recruiting, obviously we say single channel to talent's not effective anymore. A proactive recruiting approach is utilizing all your channels to talent, but in a more strategic way. So you need to have a multi-channel recruiting strategy. So that's outbound sourcing, as Stephen mentioned before. You're out, you're searching, you're engaging the multiple sources that you can search and pull in candidates from, resume databases, social networks, etc. You're also utilizing inbound attraction. So when I say job boards don't work anymore alone, job boards alone don't work anymore. They definitely work in conjunction with a very specific strategy. So you're attracting people in through job board postings, through postings on social networks, digital ads, employee referrals, any events that you do, even your internal employee pool. You're utilizing all those channels to talent with a multi-channel approach, but you're using them in a very strategic way. Proactive recruiting puts you in more control. You're going out and getting the candidates that you need that fit your profile. So you're getting fewer unqualified candidates. Proactive recruiting maximizes your programs. So you make a shift with proactive recruiting from being less transaction-based. In other words, I go out, I have a job, I get candidates in through the application process, and I either hire one or I don't, and that transaction is over, into more of a relationship-based model. So as you go out and run programs to get candidates to fill your jobs, your primary goal is to capture their information to then have continued relationships with them over time. So if you do run a particular sourcing campaign, let's say you go out and you source 25 candidates on LinkedIn, you spent a fair amount of time doing that, and you don't hire anybody, well that's not a waste because you've gathered their data, you've put them into your centralized talent pool, and you can market your jobs to them over time. So that program over time can prove out to have more value than the more transaction-based approach. So what that does is, as you're centralizing and capturing these candidate profiles for not only current jobs but for future jobs, it decreases your cost per applicant because you never have to run that LinkedIn outreach again for that particular segment because you've captured those candidates and they're in there and they're going to show up for you the next time you search and you approach you're filling a job from a sort of source first standpoint. As your centralized talent pool grows, you have ready access to qualified candidates, so it decreases your time to hire. Once you open up a requisition, you're able to easily tap your centralized talent pool to get candidates right away for that. So you're speeding your time to candidates, I would say one of the new features of Talemetry that's coming out is an auto source feature. It's coming out later this spring, where you can open a requisition and the system will automatically tap all your sources to talent based on the job requisition and pull in qualified candidates right away. So it's automatically going out and tapping all your sources to candidates, pulling those sources in, so when the recruiter sits down to recruit for that job, they've already got 50, 100 candidates that are qualified based on both your internal and external sources of talent. And we'll talk a little bit more about that centralized talent pool as we kind of get into sort of the key practices. So you're decreasing your time to hire, and the more you're out going and getting the exact candidates with the qualifications that you want, you're cultivating that centralized database to be rich in the key job families and skills that you need. You're increasing your potential for quality of hire. And all of that, as we'll talk about a little bit later, leads to more predictable recruiting outcomes. As a recruiting organization, once you've centralized your talent and you're recruiting from this source first proactive standpoint, you start to understand, what your talent pool will yield. You start to get to know numbers like what your conversion rate per month is from your talent pool. If I convert 3% of all the candidates in my talent pool to employees in any given month, I start to understand. I can begin to predict: do I need more? Do I need less in my talent pool? If I've got a pipeline of engineers within my talent pool and I convert 1% of that pipeline per year, and I'm going to need X amount of employees in the future, I'm able to sort of predict my ability to meet that demand over time.
Ian, you sold me on it, but it just seems like it might be way too hard. I mean, let's talk just a little bit about some of the impediments here. And, as I come to, sort of the conversation about what's difficult about it in an organization, I spent a decade and a half inside of, corporate HR departments, and I understand, the challenges inside of large Fortune 500 HR departments in terms of, making things like this work. So let's talk through some of these. I mean, first of all, it's perceived as way too much work to do, way too intensive, time intensive. It takes time to do this. And it's absolutely true. It does take time to build a strategy that is proactive, um, but it saves you time at the back end. I even think just in terms of our own marketing and sales stance that we do as a software company, selling our services, right? If we don't have a really good a pipeline operation, then our sales guys don't have the right people to make the connections to, and that marketing has to happen on an ongoing basis because we don't know when we're going to meet somebody who has developed the kind of need that we can meet. And it's the same way with passive candidates, right? Unless we're out there building an ongoing pipeline, we're not going to know when to really meet people, right? So it's time intensive, absolutely, but it saves time on the back end, right? It's also perceived as expensive because you do need to put a team together to do this. But when you look at a couple of things, and number one, if you're more proactive, you're going to increase your quality of hire. You're going to lower your external cost per hire, namely agency fees, which are highly expensive, and so in the long run you're going to save money. So we do a lot of work with clients just to help build the ROI and the business case around developing this approach to recruiting. And
Yeah,
certainly
and
another.
Stephen,
Yeah.
just to jump in there and just to kind of hone that point home, the more you're building your talent pool, the more you're going out and doing these searches, the more you're attracting candidates through distribution of jobs to social networks and your typical channels, job boards. You're pulling them in. You don't have to go out and pay for those again. You don't have to put that effort in again because they're existing within your talent network. So you're over time, again, it's that same process of there's an investment up front, but it pays off in spades over time.
It's a really good point. Again, I started recruiting in a headhunter firm, and the reason we were getting 25 and 30%, of a first annual salary was because of our Rolodex, right? So essentially, proactive recruiting, and we see it done both tactically, meaning you're supporting a proactive recruitment for a currently open position, or more importantly, strategically, where you're pipelining against future requirements. All of that effort is building your proprietary database of candidates, right? So you don't even have to go out to LinkedIn every time a job opens up. You've already been out there 2 and 3 months ago finding people that are potentially good. So you're absolutely right. So from a perspective of database and also agency spend and also just leveraging the money that's already being spent to pull people into your system. Now, the system, I picked up that word. Now, if we're doing all of this proactive sourcing, but we don't have a system to support it, we're going to lose a lot of the benefits. We're not going to be able to build a centralized database. We're not going to be able to reach out and do engagements. We're not going to be able to analyze what we're doing and focus on the things that are successful. So you really need a serious system to be able to support this. Another impediment is just a basic shortage of core competencies. So I think my challenge when I worked internally for corporate HR, and particularly when I moved from external into internal, was the massive amount of process and hand-holding there is in terms of doing full life cycle recruitment inside a company, right? And so oftentimes those recruiters that are internal don't necessarily have the core competencies for sourcing that oftentimes recruiters on the outside have. Now, frankly, I think even recruiters on the outside are starting to lose that capability. But then beyond that, there's some additional marketing skills that you need to have within your organization to push really effective, proactive recruiting. So there's sort of a marketing / sales competency there that needs to be built into the recruiting staff as well. It does require organizational change. People ask me often, what's the number one reason why, an implementation fails? I'll say lack of organizational change, right? The adoption of the new technology and the processes to support them, and then the executive buy-in to really push that forward. So it definitely requires very deep organizational change. So proactive recruiting is going to require, number one, a plan, right? Understanding, what our requirements are from a talent perspective, understanding, who and where that talent presides, and then planning how we're going to go to get there. But beyond that, it also requires an organizational plan. How are we going to train up the right people? How are we going to organize? And how are we going to support this in the environment? It requires a bit of a long horizon. So we've had clients come in and said, you know what, we want to start from scratch, no data whatsoever. We know that it's probably going to be 6, 9, 12 months before we start seeing really measurable results, but that's where we want to start. Other clients that have started with data have said, look, we're going to put in a new process, and by the end of the quarter, we want to see X number of hires, right? But they're taking a long view. They're not taking a 1-week view, 2-week view, what's my next opening view. It definitely takes the right technology. We could talk about that. A good CRM tool that's going to capture all of your data, and the ability to email campaign out to those folks, the ability to really mature that data, and as Ian mentioned earlier, some automation around that. So your recruiters are doing the value-added activities inside the system rather than just going out to the data sources and pulling them in. Really requires tenacious sourcers. People that are willing to send that proactive email. Hey, maybe people that are willing to reach out and send a text or make a phone call, right? For those that still remember how to use the phone and have that conversation, be tenacious about it. And then it requires measurement and refinement, right? The more integrated system you have that can capture all of the activities, all of the data sources, and include ATS data, so you can see downstream what happens, as a result of your sourcing activities. All of that pulled into a single system that has really powerful analytics that then allows you to make changes to either what you're doing or the messages you're sending out, or the talent pipelines that you're developing.
So that kind of leads us into the key practices here. So this is sort of the meat of our presentations, really what it takes to begin to make the transition here. First, it starts and revolves around this centralized talent pool. So you need to kind of centralize all your talent into one proprietary talent pool. So that includes past applicants that are typically in your ATS. That includes current employees. Could include past employees, right? So those are your kind of internal sources of talent. It also should include your external sources of talent. So those potential candidates you pull in from third-party resume databases, candidates from social sources like LinkedIn, candidates that you source, as Stephen said, on the open web, people who have opted into your talent network if you have a talent network, or just in general, all the candidates that have been gathered through all your recruiting efforts, whether it's been events, or I'm sure there's plenty of resumes sitting in recruiters' email boxes. The idea there is to centralize those all into one talent pool that you can work with and that everybody within your organization can source from. And once you have that talent pool, you need to have the goal to aggressively grow it, right? And you do that by maximizing all the channels that you have to talent to get them into your talent pool, right? So that's everybody who responds to a job ad on a job board or a social network. It's your people from your talent networks, your events, all those sources. You need to really optimize them so they're not built around necessarily filling that exact job and getting a full application. You want to engage people with an easier way to get into your talent pool, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But really, it's about maximizing all those sources of talent to feed into your talent pool. And I've got an example report here of a talent pool of about 92,000 profiles within Talemetry. And you can see there that you may be able to see there that a large portion comes from a PeopleSoft ATS. There's people who have come into the talent pool from Career Builder, job searches, resume database searches, Indeed, LinkedIn, etc. So it's really monitoring that pool, and the number one job being grow that pool, right? And understanding where that growth is coming from, so that if you want to grow it more, you can leverage those channels. And then again, don't be afraid of too much data. The idea there is that you want to be inclusive, get as many profiles in there as you can, because you can sort them out later, right? You can categorize them. We'll talk about that a little bit farther down the road. And this is what I alluded to before, which is really changing your approach to conversion, right? So the old model of conversion is you attract candidates to your jobs, they look at your jobs, and they fill out an application, full application, only at that point do you know who they are, and are you able to work with them and get them into the evaluation and hiring process, right? So the new model is more engagement based. So while you're out there searching and attracting, you need to really look at across the board how you're converting those candidates into your talent network. Now, one of the ways is things like talent pool. One of the ways is talent networks, right? You make it really easy for people to tell them a little bit about themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves, and you get their information into your database. Applications as well. You need to get serious about exactly how you're gathering application information from people. Do you need 5 pages? Do you need their high school, English teacher? Do you need their social security number? We need to get really real about what we're asking of candidates up front. You should be looking at options like 2-step applications. So it's a resume upload or a social profile extraction into your talent pool, and then an emailed link to the full application later on. But across the board, making it easier for candidates to tell them about themselves as they're engaged with you online, and an easy way for recruiters to funnel candidate information into that talent pool. So it goes from, again, you're searching, you're attracting, you're gathering that candidate data, and then that's going into your talent pool so you can search again in the future. For future jobs, you can search for that existing job, you can invite candidates to apply, then convert them to an applicant, and then retarget them over and over again as needed as they're gathered into your centralized talent pool. Now, you've got this talent pool, you're growing it aggressively, recruiters are using it, you need to organize it, right? Because you don't want a large amorphous group of candidates that you don't know anything about. So the idea there is to organize it into pipelines. And those pipelines are typically things like job families, can be individual jobs for really key positions within the organization, can be things like location. But the example here is, as you see horizontally across there, is really creating these job families and organizing the candidates by qualifications into these key job families for you. Right, so and again, you can set the bar. These are qualified engineering candidates. These are qualified QA analysts based on the resume data, their experience, their qualifications, etc. And then, a lot of people have gone that far, but what you really need to do is go a step farther, which is creating pre-applicant stages the same way that you have applicant stages within your ATS as you're moving them through the evaluation and hiring process. There are pre-applicant stages, so that the goal here is to get people into your talent pool, but then also to qualify them. As recruiters are working with them, as you're reaching out to them through email campaign, qualify them and reclassify them so that you're getting to know more and more about them and move them from the left side, which is completely new. I don't know anything about this candidate. They're new. We need to understand, excuse me, more about them, all the way through to invited to apply. And the idea there is that at each stage, you are converting them into hires, to applicants and hires at a higher rate through each of those steps. Gives you a tremendous amount of power in understanding what your future ability to hire is. For example, you may have a need for X amount of engineers, and you can look at your pipeline for engineers and you can say, well, I know my pipeline converts at 7% of all engineers per month are going to convert into an employee. And you can do the math to really understand, do you have enough in your pipeline to meet future demand? By the same token, if you've got these stages in there, you know that new engineers convert at 0.5% per month, but if I've got them qualified all the way up through, they've been tagged and reviewed, well, that converts at 7% per month. You can really start to understand at a more granular level your ability to hire and meet demand in the future.
Ian, this is a really good, a really good conversation, and just to share an example of a client that I worked with that was, using our source and CRM tool to build these sorts of stages in collaboration. They were actually building for lack of a better term, follow the sun sourcing mechanism, right? So using source and CRM to automatically go out into their internal, external databases, find sort of a wide fit to what they were looking for. So let's say for engineers, for instance. Ian, and automatically then sending the results out an email to maybe join a talent network. So that first level of engagement. Once the folks got into the next process, then they had a team in another country, their team, right, an internal team in another country that was picking that up and doing that next level of review to make sure that these were indeed engineers in the right categories, etc. Would tag and track those and push them then back into this was a New York-based company where that team then would pick them up and maybe do a next level review, and they were able to then increase their mature the data. So sometimes that offshore team would have to do a little bit more research because maybe they had a really good resume but didn't have a phone number, for instance, and they would do that research and pull that together and then push it on. And so it's a really good collaboration there, moving forward. And that we see that as cyclical. So many of us from a recruiting perspective don't see things as cyclical. We have an immediate need. We go out and try to find the needle in the haystack, and we either succeed or fail with that needle, right? And this is a much more broad and advanced and cyclical process.
Yeah, and just to again, my discipline is marketing, and this is a process that marketing has gone through over the last dozen years of adapting to this model, very much transactionally based in the past, and now definitely adopted this model of centralizing prospective customers and working with them and maturing data and understanding their desires and their needs and driving content out to them to keep them prepared and warmed up for the offers that we send out to them, and maximizing our programs in the way that we've talked about, and that's why we're talking about it for recruiting, because it's been proven to work in the broader marketing sense. And as we've talked about before, those marketing skills and as you've heard, quite broadly across a number of different venues, the link between marketing and HR and the link between marketing and recruiting especially is stronger than ever and continuing to grow in terms of tactics and competencies and strategies. So on that note, from an engagement standpoint, you've got your talent pool, you've got it organized. You can now use those pipelines to drive the engagement. So you've got those pipelines grouping people into natural areas of professional interest. You've got cohorts of professional interests there. So you can tailor nurturing campaigns out to them, which is basically just timed campaigns over time, providing them with engaging content that's valuable to them. And I kind of break these nurturing campaigns out into three areas. First is appreciation. This is typically at the front end of someone engaging with you, but you really want to show them that you really appreciate. You know that they're in your talent pool. You know that they are interested in your company, and you appreciate that. And you're going to work to match them to any appropriate jobs. The second area, which is the biggest area, and where you should spend most of your time, or I should say, channel most of your content, is providing them with information about their professional interests, teaching them how to succeed in working with your company. So that can take a number of different forms. Let's say you have a project manager pipeline and you've got a very strong project management group that is evolving the way they're doing things. Well, grab some content, grab some information, and send that out to your talent pool. It gives them a window into what that particular discipline within your organization is doing, and it also helps them professionally because it gives them information about something that is valuable to them. Or it could be even just generally curated content. If you're doing your social recruiting appropriately, you should be developing areas of content around your key job family needs for your social channels to send out. Well, you can also send that out. Let's say you've got a great article on best practices in project management for whatever particular industry you're in. You can send that out through your Twitter and through your Facebook to attract candidates in that discipline, but you can also hit your talent pool with it as well. It's valuable information for them. There's a ton of ideas around this area, and some of them are covered in the ebook that we'll provide you. But one of the ones I like is teach them how to succeed in applying for a job at your company. What are you looking for? What's your mission? What's your culture? When you're engaging with potential employees, what are you looking for? Teach them how to engage with you in terms of getting a job. Super valuable information, and it's going to make them sticky, and it's going to make them more responsive when they do show up in a sourcing campaign. When you run a search that you want to fill a job, they're going to be more likely to respond. And then branding, which in one sense should run through everything you do. You should sort of have a baseline of reinforcing that your employee value proposition throughout everything you do at a baseline level. But don't be afraid to send out certain communications that really do reinforce and showcase some of the best aspects of your employer value proposition. That could be case studies of employees, taking advantage or benefiting from some of the key employer value propositions that you have, or your brand attributes. You don't want to do a lot of this because at the end of the day, people are only sort of interested in that. But it should be a piece of the stool. One leg of the stool. So again, appreciation, education, branding, focus most on the education. And to put this in perspective, I say don't bother candidates. Don't be sending this stuff out more than at most once a month. You really don't want to bother candidates. You don't want them to unsubscribe out of your emails, and then you can't contact them again. So focus on value and don't overdo it.
And Ian, on that, don't bother candidates. I think it's really important again to point out, the strength of the system that you're using to engage with applicants. So, most ATS email systems are going to allow for maybe one or two emails out, very transactional, almost talk about appreciation. It always comes with a do not reply email address, right? And you usually don't hear anything out of the ATS until you get a final rejection, quite typically. So very unfriendly, very unengaging kinds of email campaigns coming out of the ATS. So we've had clients that have said, okay, listen, I know that we have candidates that sit in our ATS system way too long because we have these convoluted processes that keep jobs open 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So how can we use the CRM tool to remarket back out to these people, based on what status they're in the ATS? Well, your email system, your CRM system's got to have a deep integration with your ATS to be able to do that, right? And then your email capability also has to be able to let you know who you sent an email to most recently. So, in terms of not bothering candidates, can you send a mass email out and say, by the way, don't send anybody an email if they've received one within the past 7 days, right? Is your system smart enough so that you can actually target and not over target candidates?
Yeah, yeah, and I should also clarify that I'm speaking from a nurturing standpoint. These kind of high value, keep them engaged, regular campaigns. Sourcing campaigns where you're specifically reaching out and saying, hey, you meet our needs, and we are looking for candidates for this job. Send those out as much as you want. In other words, if you're targeting candidates and they show up in a targeted search, don't worry if they've gotten a nurture email 3 days before. This is just for that nurturing side of things. I think you can safely assume that candidates are wide open to hearing about jobs that you've pre-selected, pre-qualified them for, and are asking them to apply for. So
Absolutely.
you can do those all day long.
So, one of the key practices that we try to talk to our clients about is this concept of source first approach. Now, I have to say it's a little bit ironic for us to say source first because we have an automated job distribution system that pushes jobs out to free job boards as soon as they're opened in your ATS. But this is more of a proactive mindset change. So typically what would happen is people would post a job out to the job boards. They might wait 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 days to see what kind of candidate flow they have. And now all of a sudden they get through the candidates and go, well, we don't have quite the right candidates, so now we better step up the game a little bit and let's do a little bit of proactive sourcing. So now they're going to go into LinkedIn, Monster Career Builder, whatever they're going to do on their own to reach out to typically brand new candidates, right? The freshest candidates out in those third-party databases. So now, they're looking for that. When that doesn't work, they hand it off to an agency, and now you're already 6, 7 weeks into that opening, right? So if we can change the source first mechanism to say, listen, based on a fully integrated marketing and advertising and sourcing platform, let's get that job actively out in the marketplace as quickly as we can, automated without anybody touching it. Then let's run an automated search to to candidates that are already in my system and can meet that requirement or come close to meeting that requirement to get that job out to them immediately, because your response rate is going to be a lot quicker if they're getting an email from you than if you're waiting for them to stumble across the job on Indeed, right? But it's an organizational shift in terms to say, this is what we do day one when a job, or hour one when a job gets opened up, right? We're going to do a quick search for the data that we already have, open up a search to external databases, and push that job out into the marketplace proactively by email. So we've got to develop a process around that. Train a team whose specialty is doing that in support of the jobs that are getting opened. Help them understand where to search and how to search for a particularly open position, and then provide some goals and incentives around that in terms of how quickly they drive applicants into the system. And then, of course, you want to be able to, again, utilize the systems that we talked about earlier to not only support those activities, but also to track them and provide metrics as to what's working and what's not working. Sometimes that's even down to A/B testing of the emails you send out, right? And then you analyze all of that and you sort of adjust. But it's really, again, just making that key change to get out there, source first, search and target as soon as that job's open.
Yeah, and just to broaden, the idea of providing goals and incentives, you need to rethink kind of how you look at what you're incenting and what your goals are, and look at things like, uh, you know, we talked about it's very important to mature your data and to gather more of it. So some of your goals, we have several clients who set goals and objectives around how many candidates are supposed to be tagged every month by recruiters. So the idea there is to get them in the system and tagging candidates and qualifying candidates and contacting them. And the idea there is, you have obviously you have hiring goals, but chunk it up a little bit more. So you're really reinforcing that source first organizational shift, and you're changing people's behavior to actually do the activities that are going to result in that source first mindset and that source first approach.
Good point. Absolutely critical. So Ian, how do we incorporate marketing skill sets? You got to be a marketing guru like you, or how do we do it?
Well, first of all, you leverage your sales and marketing strategies and competencies that are within your organization already. So you can utilize your internal marketing group. We see a lot of organizations partnering with marketing, one approach, and as well as organizations hiring marketing skills into the recruiting department. There's no one right way to do that. I think overall, if we look at recruiting organizations, 3, 4, 5 years from now, there will be a much stronger internal native marketing skill set within them. And we see it both ways. Both ways are effective, but the idea there is that you need to understand the marketing capabilities, and that's things like sending out email campaigns. Marketing is very good at that, segmenting databases and creating personas for different job families. These are marketing type skill sets that are probably abundant within your marketing organization, and if not, those are the ones that you need to be cultivating somehow through hiring into your organization or training within your organization. And again, understand your current capabilities and then benchmark from a capability standpoint where you want to be and set goals to work towards that capability.
And as we continue to develop key practices, data is going to be really, really important, and understanding that data and identifying what activities need to be generated by what you learn from the data. So, for instance, you want to be able to measure your talent pool growth. So, first of all, overall, how many, overall is my talent pool growing? But then also, what are the sizes of each of those talent pipelines? I think Ian mentioned earlier about building those talent pipelines in a way that makes sense organizationally, but frankly isn't overly complex. But you want to be able to then to go to your system and say, so what does my pipeline look like, right? And you can develop those pipelines by by jobs or job families, or regionally, right? And always be able to know how many people do you have in that pipeline. Now, not everybody in that pipeline is going to be qualified, but you're going to start to see, you're going to be able to measure how many people it takes to have in my larger pipeline before I find a number of people who are qualified. And back when I was in the agency days, we called them QAI. So, we had to find a lot of people first before we could find the ones that were qualified. And then out of the ones that were qualified, they weren't all available. So then that, was another subset. And then those who were available weren't necessarily interested. So we had to find people that are QAI. So you need to know how big does your talent pipeline need to be to get down to that QAI level. So what are your hiring rates of your overall pool and your individual pipeline? So if I've got 10,000 in my pipeline, how many am I typically hiring from in a given month against my needs, right? Sources of candidates within the talent pool, hiring rates by source of candidates. Understanding these key metrics is going to help you be more predictable about your ability to meet the hiring demand and your ability to do so within a reasonable time frame, right? So, a little example down the bottom here, I need 300 civil engineers over the course of the next period of time. My current pipeline is 6,500 candidates that roughly fit that that description. Now, historically, I've been hiring at about 3% of my currently active candidate base, so my hiring capability is 185, right? So that clearly tells me that I've got to ramp up that front end pipeline to be able to push the hiring rates that I need. Now you begin to see how important it is to start doing that earlier in the process than later in the process. Like even in our company, if we haven't met our sales goals in Q4, we're not likely to go find an interested person who has the money to buy something in Q4. We should have found that person in Q1, right? It's the same way with recruiting. So hopefully that helps kind of illustrate that a little bit. And then finally, the final key practice here is to really optimize your organization, right? What are some of the areas that you need to look at as you optimize your organization? Data, programs, and people. So you want to ensure that you've got enough of the right kind of candidate data for sourcing. And again, from an individual perspective, I hear a lot of clients say, well, we're not really looking at monster data, or we're not looking at career builder data anymore because we like the LinkedIn data better. I remember back when I was in agency, we used to literally pay for 3-year-old data because we knew that after 3 years, people were probably ready to look for a new job, right? So don't underestimate the value of data, but make sure that you've got the right kind of data for what your target sourcing is. And then
You're dating yourself. I'm sorry, Steve. You're dating yourself again. 3 years. It's 6 months now.
Yeah,
After
thanks.
6 months.
Yeah. Also, I'll tell you that stuff came in boxes, and then finally it came in CDs. So, and then what are your programs? Can you monitor sourcing activity and metrics? Refine the messages, right? And use data to be able to monitor these things. But then more importantly is people, right? What are your recruiters doing? Are they tagging? Are they maturing the data? Are they inviting people to apply or join a talent network? Are they doing the activities that you've defined that are going to lead to building that pipeline and maturing it over time? And then you really have to be able to, number one, train for the new approach, but then also provide incentives for the new approach. And then finally, let people off the hook for the old approach in many cases, right? So make some organizational room for that change.
Yeah, so I mean, if you can monitor who your most successful recruiters are, and you can see what activities they're doing to drive that success, then you can begin to develop these key practices that you can then train across the rest of your recruiting organization, and it's is invaluable for optimizing and continual improvement.
Excellent. Well, I hesitate to say and disappointed to say this is our last slide and point for the day. So if you have any questions you'd like to queue up, I'm sure we'll have 2 minutes to answer a couple of those questions. But our final key practice is to really understand the technology. I think technology is an enabler. It's also potentially a blocker, depending upon what you have in your organization. You might not have enough technology. You might have too much technology, people are using too many diverse tools. You may not have the right level of integration with your ATS, right? Individual recruiters can do this really well on their own, right? They can't do it at scale in your organization without a really good technology footprint to be able to do this. That technology, in my opinion, requires an integration across all of CRM. I want to be able to see how my job advertising, i.e. job distribution, is impacting my ability to source, and I want to be able to utilize that data and the activity across all of that. I want my my candidate experience to be positive across that entire platform. So if I drive jobs out through distribution, or I drive calls to action out through the CRM, that my front-end candidate experience is really, really tight. So you want a really integrated CRM, and you want that to have analytics, right? And so the more it's integrated, the better your analytics will be. And then interoperability with the ATS is really key. We've got, we are deeply integrated with the largest ATS systems out there, and we see a total differential, particularly from a data perspective and also an analytics perspective, and a process perspective on being that deeply integrated, which I think is really key.
Great. Well, thanks, Stephen. That brings us to the end. We do have a few questions. So before I get to the questions, I just want to kind of say again, you will get an email within 24 hours that will give you slides for this presentation. It'll link you to a recording of this presentation, and it'll also give you a link to the Predictable Hiring ebook, which is a great step-by-step kind of guide for this whole thing. Goes into more depth, and you can always reach out to us at telemetry.com to learn more about how we can help you with that, or you can also contact me directly. We do have a few questions. The first one is, as we're running a little bit low on time, but how do you measure the hireable activity status of the candidates in the pool in the system as the data starts to age, so you know who the best candidates who might be to reach out to, i.e. the ones that are happy where they are versus the ones that are willing to look at new opportunities?
So I'll jump in on that, Ian. I wouldn't let the data age all that much, right? So this is all part of keeping that data fresh. So as your data ages a little bit, one of those campaigns is just going to be reaching out to folks and saying, hey, we're still here. I'm sure you're happy right now, but we'd love to keep in touch, and give them just a single button on that email that lets them hook up their LinkedIn profile to your CRM. So typically that's what we're seeing some of our clients who have those larger databases doing.
And you can also, I would say some other signals are you can do analysis of applicants, interviewees, hires by age of resume within your talent pool to get maybe some clues as to what the best sort of general guidelines might be in terms of when people are most likely to want to move. And then the other thing is engagement. You look at engagement to see which segments. You might have profiles that are old or aging, but they're engaged with you. They're opening your emails, and you're able to kind of track that and look for pockets of that. So those are some other signals that could give you some guidelines as to when and whether people are ready to move. Where are you locating sourcers who are experienced?
Ian, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Are we asking for specific sources of sourcing talent? Not quite sure how to answer that one in terms of good sources to sourcers.
Yeah, if we could reach out to them and we can send a question back, an answer back maybe by email if we understand exactly what the question is.
Sure. Do you have templates for the networking that you mentioned that send through the ATS for select candidates? Do you have templates for the networking that you mentioned that you send select the ATS for select candidates?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at what we mean by this question, and it might just have been that we talked about using some ATS data to segment the database and send that out. And then we also provide templates for what the email looks like that goes out as well. But once we've identified, what a really good searcher segmentation is, absolutely we can save that and then rerun that search from time to time.
Definitely. So I think that's all we have time for here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We're right at the top of the hour. So thanks again for joining us. Again, look in the email for some follow-up materials. We hope you found it valuable. We definitely enjoyed it. So have a great day on behalf of Stephen and myself. Make it a great one. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian.